Rigging robots are actually pretty easy when you understand the basics of it. In today's video, I want to show you how to easily rig up a robot within 7 steps. I will show you a simple robot rigging system and a more advanced mech robot rigging system, just so you can see how they work the same. Let's get started. I'm going to be using this model I found on Sketchfab. Link will be in the description if you want to follow along. The first thing when rigging a robot is to join the joints together. What I mean by this is that if your mesh has multiple parts for one joint, it's good to join them together to easier rig them and make it less time consuming. So here, I am selecting all the parts that my joint will have and joining them together with Ctrl J. Make sure to do this to all your limbs. After that is done, we get to finally add in the armatures to start rigging. Upon adding in the armature, you may notice that it's quite hard to see it through the mesh. We can fix this by going to the Object Properties tab and under Viewport Display, click in front. Now your armature can be seen anywhere in your scene, even if something is in its way. Next, starting with the legs, we can extrude the bones to match the limbs our robot has. We can do this by heading into edit mode and selecting the bigger size circle. Then, we can move it to where a limb starts and place it there. The smaller one should be at the other end where the next limb will begin. Continue that until you reach the final area. I like to add in an extra bone at the end for my inverse kinematics later on and disconnect its parents by pressing Alt-P and clicking Clear Parent. Now we can start connecting the bones to the armature. To do this, we need to head into pose mode and select the first bone, then head back into object mode and clicking on the limb that the bone is corresponded to. While holding down shift, click on the armature as well. Now pressing Ctrl P, we can parent the limb to the bone by pressing bone. Now you can go back into pose mode and move the bone. It should move the limbs you parented to. Repeat this process to every limb that you have. After all that is done, you may notice it's pretty hard to animate it one by one. A solution is to use inverse kinematics to easier animate these bones. Remember that extra bone we duplicated in step 3? We're using that bone for our inverse kinematics. To do this, head into pose mode and select the last bone and then select the one before that. By pressing Shift I, we can add in an IK to active bone. Now, when selecting the last bone and moving it, every other limb should move with it as well.
Hey, sorry to interrupt, but I found out the legs are not practical to animate this way and found a way to help animate them better. So, head into edit mode and add in another bone on top of the inverse kinematics bone to rotate around the last limb. Then head back into pose mode and select the new bone we created. Now in object mode, connect the final limb to that bone by clicking on the limb, then the armature, then clicking Ctrl P and connecting to bone. Now when animating, we can rotate that bone to rotate the final limb. Now you can animate it easier. Alright, back to the video.
Depending on your mesh, it can be easily duplicated to the other side without any issue. The one I'm using for example works pretty well. To do this, select the armature and the limbs that it's connected to and duplicate it with Shift D and rotate it to match your other limbs. If your object's legs are symmetrical, simply just press Shift R to repeat the previous action. After all of that, we can end it off by creating a main controller bone. This bone allows us to control the robot's body rotation. To do this, add in an empty object, any you want. I'm going to go with a cube and put it where your robot's body is. After that, select the robot's body and parent it to the empty by pressing Ctrl P and clicking on object. Now, when you move the empty, the robot body moves with it, but the legs aren't moving with the body at all, which is what we don't want. We can combat this by selecting all the armatures and going into pose mode. Select one bone that is at the beginning and head into the bone constraint properties tab and add in a child of constraint. In the target section, select the empty we created for the body. Repeat this for every other armature as well. Now, when you go back into object mode and move the empty, the entire leg will follow the robot's upper body movement. There you have it, a simple robot rigging system. Now, let's move on to a more advanced robot rigging system. For this next one, I will be using this model I found on Sketchfab. Link will be below if you want to follow along as well. The first step I would do is join all my joints together into one singular piece. Try your best to select the entire joint and join them together. I noticed that my robot's arm has a singular rotational part, so I merged all of them together as a single piece. The robot's torso has two parts, so I separated them. One for the bottom half of the body, while the top rotates on its own. These are some things to take into account when merging your joints together. Starting with the legs again, I added in an armature and put the bigger side at the start of my legs while the smaller side goes to where the next joint starts. Be sure to do this until the final joint. I also added in an extra bone for my inverse kinematics later and disconnect its parents with Alt-P and clicking Clear Parent. After that is done, we can start joining the joints and the bones together. To do this, head into pose mode and click on the first bone, then go back into object mode and select the joint that the bone is corresponded to. While holding down shift, select the armature as well. Now, we can click Ctrl P and select bone. Repeat this process until the final joint. Now we can add in the inverse kinematics. First, click the extra bone we duplicated, then select the one before that as well. Now press Shift I and click Add IK to active bone. Now, when moving the last bone, everything else should move as well. With this robot, there is a piston that follows the legs as you can see here. To make it work with the robot, we can select it and head into edit mode. By pressing A, we can select the entire mesh and press P to separate it by loose parts. Now we can select the hinge parts and go into edit mode again. Here, I am separating them into 2 parts by pressing C and selecting one side. Then, I press P and click selection to separate it by selection. We can now extend the other side to the bottom of the one we just separated. If you have 2 of the same one, just duplicate it over. Now with the armature, we can duplicate any bone and clear its parents with Alt-P and click Clear Parent. Then, move the bigger side to the start of the hinge and the smaller side to the end of the same hinge. Now we can duplicate the same hinge and move it to the other end and rotate it accordingly. After that, we can finally connect the hinge to its bones. Same as we did before, go into pose mode and select the bone and head back into object mode and select the hinge is connected to. While holding down shift, click on the armature as well. Then, by pressing Ctrl P, we can parent it to bone. Repeat this to the second hinge as well. Now we can make it so that both hinges look at each other. To do this, select one of the hinge's bones in pose mode and head into the bone constraint properties tab. Now add in the dam track constraint. With the target, we can select the armature. With the bone, we can select the other hinge's bone. Repeat this to the other hinge as well. Now when you move the armature, the hinge still doesn't move at all. To fix this, we need to select the armature and head into edit mode. Select the hinge bone first, then the leg bone that is corresponded to, and click Ctrl P, then keep offset. Repeat this to the other hinge as well. Now, upon moving the armature, the hinges should move as well. With any extra part, connect it to the armature with Ctrl P. Then, you can duplicate the hinge's bone to the other ones and parent it properly. Here, since my legs are the same, I am duplicating it and moving it to the other side. The way I'm doing that is putting my 3D cursor to the middle of the world and making my pivot point to the 3D cursor. Then, selecting my leg, I duplicated it with Shift D and scaled it to the other side. Now we can move on to the hands. Again, since my hands are just one singular part, I only need one bone around its pivot point. Then, I simply parent the hand to the bone with Ctrl P and select bone. Using the same method for duplicating the leg, I duplicated the arms to the other side. Then, we move on to the torso. I separated my torso into 2 separate parts, so this requires 2 different empties. One empty goes on the bottom half, and the other goes on top. I then parented my body to the empty I created by selecting the body, then selecting the empty, then pressing Ctrl P and selecting object. Then, I connected the 2 empties together by clicking on the top empty first, and then the lower one and pressing Ctrl P and selecting object. Now when moving the lower one, it should also move the top one. Then, we can start connecting all the limbs to the body. To do this, select all of the armature and head into pose mode. Select the first bone, go into the bone constraint properties to add in the child of constraint. With the target, click on the empty that the bone is corresponded to. For this one, it would be the bottom empty. Repeat with the second leg. For the hands, do the same exact thing, but this time select the top empty, since that's what it's corresponded to. Now, when moving each of the empties, it should move what is corresponded with. The bottom empty should move the entire rig. And there we have it, 2 robots fully rigged. Now you can animate pretty much anything. Have a great one and subscribe.